Well, who would expect a Bible reading from Matthew when we're coming to consider the prophet Micah? Probably not many of us, but that's the curious thing about this prophet that we've come to spend a few nights looking at, God willing. Because in a strange kind of way, this particular prophet contains perhaps some of the most well-known sections in Scripture. Standouts. And yet, certainly I could speak for myself, I knew so little about him. I didn't know really who he was, when he came, what he spoke about, or indeed why. And that's what we've got ahead of us, an exciting journey to go on, because this is a great prophecy, and the point has been made beforehand that, Micah is described as one of the minor prophets, but that's only in terms of how many words have been written. Certainly the message that he has is a great message, and it had an enormous influence on the people around him. And to kick that off, let's come with me to the prophecy of Micah, and we'll just see some of those outstanding and well-known sections of the prophecy that we know so well. Micah chapter 4 is perhaps one of the most recognisable. Micah chapter 4 verse 1. But in the last days it should come to pass that the mountain of the house of Yahweh shall be established in the top of the mountains, shall be exalted above the hills. People shall flow unto it. Many nations shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways. We will walk in his paths, for the Lord shall go forth of Zion, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. And then it continues, and you're saying to yourself, that's not Micah, that's Isaiah. And it is. Isaiah chapter 2. We use it in lectures. But as we'll see when we come to this section in Micah, God willing, in a couple of classes' time, it's probably most likely that Isaiah quotes Micah rather than Micah quoting Isaiah. What a remarkable thing that is. So that incredibly well-known section, which actually continues all the way through to verse 5, is the words of Micah, quoted by Isaiah and used by us time and time again. Our reading that Russell read for us, what an incredible extraction from the prophet Micah that is, isn't it? There's Herod, Matthew chapter 2. He hears that there's a king born. He goes out and says to all the religious rulers, where is this king going to be born? And from on a surface perspective at least, from the most obscure part in Micah chapter 5 verse 2, these religious rulers decipher correctly where the Lord would be born, in Bethlehem, Judah. I mean, we sort of take it for granted a little bit because we're familiar with the story. We've read Matthew chapter 2. We can put the quotes together, but literally, if we didn't have Matthew chapter 2, how many of us would have been able to find from Micah chapter 5 verse 2 and be confident that this was indeed referring to where our Lord will be born? Perhaps arguably one of the most important prophecies about the beginning of our Lord. It's incredible, isn't it? And again, we know Micah 5 verse 2 well, but how many of us understand the context of Micah 5? Where it fits in? Why did Micah suddenly, it seems, start writing about where this future Messiah would be born? Well, God willing, we're going to work our way through and see if we can uncover that. In terms of those sort of hallmark quotations, just have a look in Micah at chapter 6. Verse 6 through 8, again, extremely well-known quote, isn't it? Wherewith shall I come before Yahweh and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come with burnt offerings, with calves? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams? Verse 8. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth Yahweh require of thee, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God. Who hasn't heard that quote? We know it well, don't we? But who's talking? Who's the man? Well, God willing, we're going to find that out. And this is the exciting thing about Micah. This is the exciting thing about this prophecy, because there's all these well-known quotes that we've come across and that are powerful in both the picture they create. And look at the end of Micah, the very, perhaps not so well known, but nonetheless, from a powerful point of view. Have a look at Micah chapter 7, verse 18. Who is an ale like unto thee, that pardoneth iniquity, passeth by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in mercy. He will turn again. He will have compassion upon us. He will subdue our iniquities. What a great expression that is. Thou wilt cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. Thou wilt perform the truth to Jacob and the mercy to Abraham, which thou hast sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. What a remarkable prophecy. And what we've just looked at there, if you like, sort of almost little flashes of familiarity. And God willing, over the next 3 classes, and probably with an exhort thrown in, I think I might do a Josh Smith version and extend it out that way. God willing, we'll cover off and draw the line between all those seemingly unrelated quotes, because they're not unrelated. They paint this magnificent story of God appealing to his people. Do you know, the beginning of Micah, I mean, we just read the end of Micah, and it's a beautiful reflective end, isn't it? But have a look at the beginning. Because when we're first introduced to Micah, it's a very uncompromising start, isn't it? Now, you ignore verse 1. Verse 1's just there. That's the administrative details, if you like. So far as the prophecy of Micah is concerned, forget verse 1 and look how he starts. Verse 2. Hear, all ye people. Hearken, O earth, and all that therein is, and let Adonai Yahweh be witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, Yahweh cometh forth out of his place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. The mountains will be molten. He creates this mental picture of a volcano. Valleys cleft, wax before the fire. He doesn't sort of gently ease into the prophecy, does he? It's like, wham! Listen up. God has a serious message to get across. And I think the beginning of Micah and the end of Micah give us this beautiful insight into his character. Because he is, at one and the same time, absolutely uncompromising and unwavering and faithful in terms of getting God's message to the people. He doesn't sort of dress it up, or he doesn't make it feel a bit more palatable. But so far as the man himself is concerned, we see a man who desperately wanted the people to listen and was doing all he could to turn them around. And this is another of the exciting things about Micah, as we paint this sort of beginning picture and start to form where we're going to go with this prophecy. Because so many of the prophets, through no fault of their own, but so many of the prophets had this challenge where they went through their whole prophetical ministration against opposition and without making the impact that they so desperately wanted. But the beauty is that Micah does have this evidence of a turnaround by the people, which is quite remarkable. And I want you to come with me to Jeremiah chapter 26, because we see again in this way that it seems to be such a Micah way of his name just suddenly appearing and the impact of his prophecies suddenly appearing on the scene. In the midst of relative obscurity, we have an instance here in Jeremiah chapter 26. So the background to this is that there's a significant pushback against the prophecies of Jeremiah. And you can see if I just... Verse 12, Jeremiah 26, Jeremiah speaks to the princes and to the people, saying, Yahweh sent me to prophesy against this house and against this city all the words that ye have heard. Now amend your ways and your doings and obey the voice of Yahweh your God. So that's Jeremiah's message, which is very similar, as we will see, to the message that Micah was giving. And we know that, Jeremiah makes the point that his life was in his hands. In verse 16, we'll pick it up from there. Then said the princes and all the people unto the priests and to the prophets, this man, Jeremiah, is not worthy to die, for he hath spoken to us in the name of Yahweh our God. Then rose up certain of the elders of the land and spake to all the assembly of the people, saying, here he is, our prophet. Micah the Morasite prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and spake to all the people of Judah, saying, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, Zion shall be ploughed like a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of a forest. So here they are quoting, and we can find this quote, it's the beauty of it, chapter 3 of Micah. We can see that very quote, and we know that Micah gave that quote to Hezekiah. And then the princes continue on. Did Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all Judah put him at all to death? Did he not fear Yahweh and besought Yahweh, and Yahweh repented him of the evil which he had pronounced against them? Thus might we procure great evil against our souls. So, what's the point of going there? Well, the point of going there is Micah's prophecy, as challenging as it was, as hard as it was, as bitter sometimes as the message is that he's going to have to give, it had an effect. It impacted people, particularly Hezekiah and those that were around Hezekiah. Now, that might not sound particularly remarkable, but it is when you consider that Micah was a peer prophet to Isaiah. And Micah, as we'll see shortly, Micah came from a completely different background from Isaiah. Isaiah had, as it were, the voice of the king. Isaiah was in the court of the king. And yet, it was clear to everyone in that court, absolutely clear to everyone in that court, that Micah had made the impact on Hezekiah. Isn't that a remarkable thing? A testament to this man, a testament, of course, to Hezekiah, a testament to the power of God to be able to change people. So this evening, as I've sort of got there, the who, when, what and why, this evening is really just about us building the background of this prophecy. Those of you that will have heard me use this expression before, but I like to get that high view, the 30,000 foot view, as it were. And then what that'll help us do is we'll be able to create the scene, we'll understand the background, we'll understand the message, the times of the message, and then that will allow us in subsequent classes to be able to delve into each of the sections of Micah's prophecy in a lot more detail and understand why they've been crafted the way that they have. So first up, who was Micah? Well, Micah's name means who is like Yah, which is what we've got as our title there, as you can see on the screen. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because this name is appropriate both as a question, i.e., who is like Yah, and as a statement, Micah, who is like Yah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because as a question, the message that Micah was going to give was really going to challenge the people. And there's lots of ways that the challenges that the people of Israel and Judah were going through are described in Micah. But in absolute simple terms, the people had not been behaving like God. That's the issue. There's details there. They're proud. They're devising iniquity. Describes them, going to bed at night and thinking up cunning plans, ready to put into play the next day. Talks about them being violent oppressors. From a leadership point of view, they took bribes, sort of going to the full extreme. They're described as eating up God's flock. But at the end of the day, they're just manifestations. They're just different manifestations of a divergence away from being like God. That's the problem. No, none of those sort of fleshly behaviours in and of themselves is, to a certain extent, any worse than any of the others, because they're all far from being like God. And Micah is all about trying to bring them back to God. to be like God, to show God's characteristics. Now, if they refuse to align, Micah is going to describe what the consequences are going to be. They would be consequences put into place by nations coming against them. They were very visible and very timely. So there would be consequences if they refused to align. But if they did respond, then God would lovingly bring them into his purpose, as we saw by those words at the end of Micah. So as a question, it's very appropriate, isn't it? Who is like Yah? That's the call. Who is like Yah, says Micah, through his name, as he goes out on his prophecy. But as a statement, it's true as well. Because Micah himself was like God. I mean, Micah has this great blend of God's characteristics. We've already sort of touched on that anyway. You think, and I'm not drawing comparisons between prophets here, but I guess to some extent you can't help but do it. But you take Elijah, for example. Now, Elijah had very much a judgment-driven message, didn't he? Backing it up with strong behaviour, and we can probably picture the scene when fire was brought down from heaven and consumed the companies when they came there. I only am left, says Elijah. A great prophet doing a great job on Yahweh's behalf, but very much a judgment-driven message. Other prophets, again, faithful prophets that God worked with and developed as he does with us all, but I thought of Jonah, for example. Well, he grappled, didn't he, when God asked him to give a prophetic message that Jonah thought was misaligned with Israel's best interests. Jonah objected, ran away, caught a boat to Tarshish. But Micah faithfully gives God's message, in all its harshness as it appears, and all with absolute clarity, with a requirement for change, with clearness around what the consequence would be if they didn't change. But we're going to see this absolutely wonderful structure to his book shortly. We're going to see how every one of the three parts of Micah ends with this magnificent message of hope. It's just such a wonderful thing because, and in doing so, we see Micah is this perfect manifestation of God's character. He literally became someone that people could look at and identify with God. His message from God came through in the life that he lived and the way he lived it. Now we know that Micah, as verse 1 says there, and I always grapple with this pronunciation, so you're going to have to put up with me sort of lisping my way through it, but he's described as Micah the Morashthite. So where is that? Well, there is a little uncertainty around it, but generally, so far as the region is concerned, people are pretty confident. So here's a map of the land of Israel. You can see that section there just on the west side of the Dead Sea. It's been blown up here, so you can see there's the west side of the Dead Sea. And there's Moresheth Gath up there, which is probably the town that he came from. There's another town called Marashah. And you can see, you probably can't from back there, but there's little question marks against some of these. So, on the map of Israel, they're probably around about there-ish. And whilst they're not 100% sure, they are confident that it's in this Shephelah part, which is really like those low foothills that exist between the plain and the Judean mountains on the side there. And just, I guess, to get a little bit of context, and God willing in our next class we'll see some of these places, but some of the towns that you probably know reasonably well, Lachish, that was a fortified town that was there. There's Bethlehem, obviously in the Judean hills, and of course, as we saw, and as we know, in Micah chapter 5 verse 2, Micah makes that remarkable prophecy about the Messiah being born in Bethlehem, Hebron, and so on. So you can sort of get a rough feel for the general location. But clear is two things. One of them is Micah was, for want of a better expression, he came from the country. He wasn't part of the regal or royal group that were centred in and around Jerusalem, but he literally lived out on the frontier, and this was very much frontier town. And again, we'll see this because what ended up happening was when there were battles, and this map's probably better, battles between empires, Syria, for example, or Assyria, and Egypt. This was the coastal plain was the normal route that those armies went. And so in this Shephelah bit, these foothills, this is where Israel tried to really fortify themselves against any of those nations coming through and getting stuck in, deciding that they'd pick up a little bit of Israel along the way and doing a right-hand turn in there. And so these cities along here tended to be right at the forefront of the protection of the nation. And you need to remember that, because God willing, in our next class, we're going to see that as painful as it was for Micah, given that he came from this town, probably had a great deal of love for the town folk that he knew so well, but he's going to give a prophecy about one of those consequences being the destruction by Assyria as they make their way through this region. And, you can only imagine how painful that would be as Micah had to describe it. And in my mind, knowing where he came from and what he did and the fact that he wasn't related to sort of the royal court and things, I really liked this picture of him. Now, obviously, this isn't a picture of him, just in case you're taking notes. But searching around, you've got him there, he's just in pretty normal clothes, he's got the sort of skin that's reddened by the sun, hands that look like they've worked hard. It created this really strong mental picture. And as I'm looking at the study of Micah and his prophecies, that sort of mental picture of him's come through really strong. So very much a man with a message. So, as I mentioned before, Micah and Isaiah were peers. They had quite different backgrounds. Isaiah himself being really in the court of the king, whereas Micah coming from that country area. In fact, I can't remember who did it. Might have been Uncle Grant. Someone did a lecture a couple of weeks ago and actually showed how they found the seal of Isaiah close to, it was someone. Anyway, it was an interesting and good lecture, but again, it just emphasised how close. I thought, was it Steve McGeorge? There you go. Thanks, Steve. Yes, that Isaiah had that close contact with Hezekiah in particular and with the court of the king. So, when did Micah prophesy? Well, we get our famous map that we all know and love so well. And if we just zoom in a little bit here, we can see where Micah is. So on the main map, it's this sort of section back here, and I've just blown it up so we can see. So you can see that he was roughly around this period 740 through to around 700 BC is the time that he ran. And we know that's the case because, again, if we continue on in verse 1 of Micah 1, we read that the word of Yahweh came to Micah in the days of Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. And therefore it's quite easy to align him with these same kings that are described in chapter 1, verse 1. And again, this demonstrates what a tumultuous period of time this was when Micah was the prophet. It's really, first of all, we saw he's contemporary with Isaiah, so you can see that their prophetic periods crossed over quite a lot. Hosea, but of course he was prophesying specifically to the kingdom in the north. And we'll say a little bit about that as well, because to some extent Micah was as well. But look at the impact that happened here. So this is the Syrian kings, and you can see that the Syrian kings were destroyed during this period of time. And they were, of course, destroyed by the Assyrian kings, who ended up increasing in power dramatically through here. So the Assyrian Empire, which was resisted by pretty much every other nation, and particularly the northern tribes, the northern kingdom with Syria, unsuccessfully pushed against Assyria, and Assyria ended up destroying Syria, and then ultimately, as we know only too well, at the same time, basically, the northern kingdom was given a bit of a hiding, and then it was ultimately destroyed and the northern kingdom taken into captivity at the end of Hoshea. So it was really a period of international manoeuvring, the end of Syria, the end of the northern kingdom, and a time when change was happening and decision making was occurring at both an international and at a domestic level. And if we think about the domestic one first, in a sense, it's really the ecclesial context, isn't it? It's this ecclesial context which is going to form the primary frame for Micah's prophecy. And what was that context? Well, we know, don't we? Because it was the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And what were those times like? Well, the first one, Jotham. We read about him in 2 Kings chapter 15 and in 2 Chronicles chapter 27. In fact, let's turn up 2 Chronicles 27 because we can follow through these three kings and just get a bit of a flavour as to what they were like. Remind ourselves, perhaps, as to what the conditions were when they were in power. So Jotham started his reign when he was 25 years old. And we read there in verse 2, his summary, he did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that his father Uzziah did. Howbeit he entered not into the temple of Yahweh. So it's a pretty good response, isn't it? He did that which was right. And verse 6 actually extends that a little, doesn't it? Verse 6, so Jotham became mighty because he prepared his ways before Yahweh his God. So if you like, the divine record, the divine report card for Jotham is fairly positive. He did the good things that his father had done, not the bad things, and he became mighty because he prepared his ways before Yahweh. But verse 2 at the end there describes the situation so far as the people were concerned. And it's a strange thing, isn't it? You've got a relatively good king preceding Jotham, his father, and then Jotham comes along who continues the good stuff, but yet, the end of verse 2, the people did yet corruptly. So if you put the extreme generalisation, but if you put a little summary about the time of Jotham, he was a good king with bad people. The next king was Ahaz. Now, I apologise again for whoever these individuals are that I've just taken their pictures and applied them there, but hopefully, I have nothing against this particular individual, whoever it is, but it just seemed to be faces that fitted. So let's have a little look at Ahaz. What was he like? Well, have a look at 2 Chronicles 28, so along the page there, verse 2. This is remarkable, isn't it? So remember, he's the king of Judah. For he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and made also molten images for Balaam, and he burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, burned his children in the fire after the abominations of the heathen whom Yahweh had cast out before the children of Israel. He sacrificed also, burned incense in high places, on the hills, under every green tree. His reign was a disaster. He was an idolater. And in 2 Kings, it actually describes how, when he was beaten up by the Syrians, and then he got help to go and take them out, he went over to Damascus, he looks around and he says, oh, I like that altar. I'll get a map of, plan of that and get one of those built in Jerusalem. That'll be a good trick. Completely unsuccessful reign. And I don't think this is an exaggeration, but of all of the reigns of the kings, I think Ahaz's was the most miserable and unsuccessful of them. His alliances were terrible, and he was effectively beaten by just about every nation there was going around. And you get that. You get God's perspective of it. Have a look at verse 19 of chapter 28. For Yahweh brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of, here it is again, Israel. For he made Judah naked and transgressed sore against Yahweh. I mean, he's like, he just is doing the worst over and over again. And Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, remember him? We saw him on our timeline, didn't we? He was gaining in ascendancy during this period of time, becoming the power broker of the region. When Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came unto him and distressed him and strengthened him not, this was after Ahaz had paid a whole lot of money to him. For Ahaz took away a portion out of the house of Yahweh, out of the house of the king and of the princes, and gave it unto the king of Assyria, but he helped him not. And in the time of his distress did he trespass yet more against Yahweh. And then it's almost like the record is trying to come up with how to describe Ahaz. And it just finishes with sort of the expression to capture it all, and it says, this is that King Ahaz. So it's like, you just can't believe what kind of king he was. He sacrificed unto the gods of Damascus because he saw that they were successful, and he thought maybe they'd help him, and ended up creating a disaster so far as the nation was concerned. So, whoops, that's a mistake there. That's supposed to be bad king. That's a little test. Did anyone pick that test up? If you're writing notes, put bad king there. The old copy paste. So, good king, bad people, bad king, bad people. Little test. And who's the third? No guesses for what this king was like. Hezekiah. And we're not going to look at the record other than just picking up that little summary. Turn over a couple of pages to chapter 31. What an amazing description this is. He's outstanding king. And his outstandingness is contrasted by how poor his father was. So his father was like, the worst king you could have. That King Ahaz. And Hezekiah, have a look at him in verse 20 and 21 of chapter 31. Thus did Hezekiah throughout all Judah. He wrought that which was good and right and truth before Yahweh his God, and in every work that he began in the service of the house of God, and in the law, and in the commandments, to seek his God, he did it with all his heart and prospered. Amazing man. And the summary for him, correctly, good king, good people. So this is the challenge that Micah had. It was a time where literally between leadership and people, depending which king was in power at the time, there was quite dramatic differences in response. And in the north, from a domestic perspective, the northern kingdom of Israel, disaster. Absolute disaster. There was Pekah, the son of Remaliah, who was godless, self-seeking, aggressive, aligned with Syria. And there was Hoshea, who succeeded him, who similarly was godless, vacillating. He paid tribute, then he stopped paying tribute. He was inconsequential and ineffective. And you've got this is the group of people that Micah is needing to bring on the journey that God has got for him to do. It's a challenge, isn't it? Sometimes we think, we've been, maybe we've got a task we need to do, and we think, boy, that's a challenging task. Well, imagine Micah's challenging task when he's got this variety of people and their different responses that they had, and all of them he's trying to bring to become like unto Yahweh. I'm not going to bother going through the international change. I've sort of touched on some of those as well, but the key point being that Assyria became the dominant empire led by Tiglath-Pileser. And then, of course, he died in the middle of all his power, and then those who succeeded him continued on with that. But one of the things that you would have picked up before, and it's particularly in the life of Ahaz, is this alignment between Israel, the northern 10 tribes that were sort of given the names Israel normally, and Judah in the south. Now, when we come back to the prophecy of Micah, we can see that that is one of the themes, one of the messages, if you like, that Micah is going to get across to the people. And this was a challenging thing. This was a challenging thing. Because the people in Judah did not see themselves like the people in Israel, who they saw as godless and without God, going their own way. And the people in Israel tended to despise the people in Judah. People in Israel were making alliances with the nations around them and setting themselves up for greatness and in control of their own destiny. Despise those people in Judah. And yet we come to the message of Micah, and God says, actually, you know what? You're the same. You're the same. One lot despising the other. One lot considering themselves holier than the other. God says, you're the same. You're not like me. That's the problem. And have a look at how the two are linked together. So, we've already read verse 1. Word of Yahweh comes to Micah in the days of these Judah's kings. So, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah are all kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria. Now, that's obviously the capital of Israel in the north, and Jerusalem. See how it links the two? So even though the prophecy was being given to the region of Judah, the prophecy itself related to both the northern tribes, Samaria, as well as Jerusalem, the capital of the southern tribes. We already saw, didn't we, in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, Ahaz is described like he's a king of Israel, even though strictly speaking he wasn't. But he's described that way because his behaviour was, to all intents and purposes, just like theirs. But this theme continues on. Have a look at verse 5 of Micah chapter 1. For the transgression of Jacob is all this, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what are the high places of Judah? Are they not Jerusalem? See how, again, the prophet's linking these both areas together. You've got transgressions happening in the northern kingdom, Samaria, and you've got these high places happening in the southern kingdom in Judah. Verse 6, therefore I will make Samaria as a heap of the field, as plantings of a vineyard. I'll pour out the stones into the valley, I'll discover the foundations thereof. If you come across to chapter 3, you can see that exactly the same prophecy, the same potential consequence, the same warning is given to Judah. Have a look at verse 12 of Micah 3. Therefore shall Zion for your sake be ploughed as a field. Jerusalem shall become heaps. The mountain of the house is the high places of the forest. So you've got the same prophecy being given to Samaria as is given later on to Judah. Interestingly, you might have picked it up, that's the prophecy in Jeremiah 26 that was given to Hezekiah, who responded and changed, and God repented him of that prophecy. So that's the specific one that's referred to in Jeremiah. Isn't that cool? It's nice sort of seeing, we read them as if they're unrelated books in a sense. That's how naturally we can tend to read it, but they're not. These are the real life people interacting, and we can see that effect and impact. Go back to chapter 1 again, just continuing this theme of Samaria and Judah. If you have a look at verse 9 of chapter 1, you can see, for her wound is incurable, for it is come unto Judah. Now, who's the her there at the beginning of verse 9? Well, if you go back, it's continuing on the statement that is started in verse 6. So, I'll make Samaria as a heap of the fields, and then continues through 7 and 8 up to 9. For her, Samaria's wound is incurable, for it is come unto Judah. See that? So there's, again, this Micah, God, through Micah, is linking the northern and the southern nations together. I'd never have believed it, never have dreamed it. We're not like them. You know, but God's saying you are, because you're not like me. 1 verse 13. O thou inhabitant of Lachish, bind the chariot to the swift beast. She's the beginning of the sin to the daughter of Zion. Why? For the transgressions of Israel were found in thee. The transgressions of Israel were found in Zion. And if you go over to the chapter 6, we can see how the behaviour of Judah is aligned with, if you like, almost the patriarchal structure of Israel. In verse 16 of Micah 6, for the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab, and ye, Judah, walk in their counsels, says God. So he's basically saying, you take your laws from Omri, and if he wasn't sort of bad enough, and he was a pretty bad king in the northern kingdom, and you take your behaviour, the guide for your behaviour, from Ahab. And we know Ahab had the unfortunate tag of being married to Jezebel and bringing Israel so low as a consequence of her influence on the nation. So you can see again, and it just emphasises this point, that whilst the people felt there was a difference, whilst the people, and we'll see this in some of the detail, they thought that they were the people of God, for example, those in Judah, they saw themselves in contrast to the people in the northern kingdom. They could sort of imagine God's judgments coming upon Samaria. That seemed to make sense. They couldn't imagine the punishments coming upon them. And God, through Micah, says, you're the same. There's going to be lots of individual sort of soul searching, it won't there, brothers and sisters, as we work our way through this prophecy, because there's great lessons for us in that. You know, the exciting thing is, though, that in and amongst that, there's this great hope that exists in there. And I mentioned this before, but Micah has this magnificent structure to it. Magnificent. And I quite like sort of structure, so this works really well. And for this, I'm going to give a little shameless plug for Manny, not him personally, but if you're ever after a really good book, this book by Brother Reg Carr is absolutely excellent. It's in the library, $21, cheap at twice the price. But he really builds this structure up. So I've pretty much taken this directly from him. But it works, it really works. Because what ends up happening is there's titles or beginning lines that mark these three separate parts of Micah. Let's just have a real quick look at them. Chapter 1, verse 2. Hear, all ye people, hearken, O earth. See the call there to hear. Chapter 3, verse 1. And I said, hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, and ye princes of the house of Israel. And then chapter 6, verse 1. Hear ye now what Yahweh saith. Continues on, verse 2. Hear, O ye mountains. So you've got these calls. Hear, 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 3 times. So that you end up with this really neat 3-part structure to the prophecy. Now, if it was just that would be interesting, but not necessarily convincing. But where the convincing piece is the next bit, because every single one of those parts, and this really picks up that character and alignment of Micah's character with Yahweh himself, because every single one of them has the first part, which is a section of judgment. So in part 1, it's judgment on Israel and Judah, essentially as the collectives, we might describe them. The second part specifically targets the leadership, Judah's leadership, and as we will see, are doing terrible things. And the third part is judgment on the people of Judah and the city of Jerusalem. But every single one of those parts has a second piece to it. And this is the absolute magnificent piece to it, because every one of them re-emphasising the point of the prophecy, which is to bring people to God. It's not to condemn people. Micah wasn't given to destroy all the people. God could have done that without Micah. Don't need a prophecy to do that. God could just do it. But the point of Micah is he wants to bring people back to him. He wants to make people think like him, behave like him. And so each one of these parts has this beautiful deliverance piece. It's absolutely magnificent. You've got deliverance for the remnant. We'll go through this next time, God willing. Beautiful mental picture of sheep without a shepherd that have suddenly got one. You've got our section here, and of course, now we're starting to see some context, aren't we? Micah 5 verse 2, the one who's the Messiah, where he's going to be born. Lo and behold, that fits into this deliverance for Zion piece. It's sort of making sense, isn't it? That might be why we would have a leader come forth. And then the last bit, which again is just a beautiful piece there, is the ultimate deliverance for all of God's people. You know, it's if you like, God's purpose coming to fruition for all time. Magnificent theme. And that is such a neat little, or not little, such a neat structure. And you might say, well, it's a bit amazing that someone could give prophecies and they somehow fit into this great structure. If you have a look at chapter 3, verse 1, you get the idea that possibly the structure of what we read here is actually really more prophetic highlights that Micah has put together rather than a transcript of his words as he said them. So you can see that in chapter 3, verse 1. See how he says, "And I said, hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob." See how he sort of puts that in the past tense? That's probably a clue that Micah gave his prophecy over the reign of those three kings. And then when the prophecy of Micah that we read was put together, what we've got is the condensed version, the compilation, if you like, the summary of the highlights. And that would help explain why there's this beautiful pattern to the overall prophecy of Micah. But it also does something else, brothers and sisters. If that's the case, so it's not just sort of the verbatims as he spoke, not just the transcript, but it's actually a specifically compiled summary. And it's pretty important we understand the whole lot, because it's all been put together because it was the key and most important parts of his message. Right, so we've got just a couple of other things before we bring ourselves to an end for tonight. Some themes, and we won't spend a lot of time on this because we will do these, God willing, as we go through the detail. But one of them that comes through so beautifully in Micah is this theme of sheep, shepherds, and the flock. And you could see all the bits and pieces. Again, we won't go through them, but this will be next week's, God willing, or in a fortnight's time, where we'll look at this beautiful section of deliverance and God gathering together this mixed up bunch of sheep with no leader. You got the people here around the rulers. They hated good. They plucked the skin off the sheep. You eat the flesh of my people. Again, New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 5, you've got themes coming through consistently about leadership and the responsibility of leaders to not consume the flock, isn't it? To not fleece the flock, but to feed the flock. There's a reference there to Eder, the tower of the flock. Again, a beautiful little link, because 4 verse 8 links so nicely with chapter 2, but we'll go through that, God willing, as we get there. And the theme continues on. You've got this whole section in chapter 5, which is all about the theme of sheep shepherds. Here you've got the ruler, our Lord Jesus Christ, who's going to stand and feed his people, who'd be the peace when the Assyrian would come into the land. And interestingly enough here, so powerful would God be for his people that they would end up being like a lion and the nations would end up being like flocks of sheep in comparison. It's almost like a funny one because the imagery flips on its head. It says, well, now you're like a lion, and comparatively, strength-wise, compared to the rest of the nations who'll be like sheep. And you can see there this appeal to God, feed thy people with thy rod, the flock of thine heritage, and so appropriate for our opening hymn from Psalm 23 about the Lord being our shepherd. So hopefully you can see that nice little link there where the sentiments of Micah and the themes that come out fit so beautifully. The other thing that we will see as we go through it is this, what we might call the consequence model. Now, again, this is part of that clarity piece that Micah was giving. So there are a whole number of therefores that appear throughout the prophecy of Micah. And God really makes the point that if you don't change, you can do something to change. Hezekiah being a classic example of it. You can do something, but if you don't change, there's a consequence. And the consequence is inevitable. And again, I'll just go through these and just give you a flavour because we'll touch on these when I get to the last one, that one, as we work our way through each of the studies. But there's a sort of a pattern and an appropriateness, if you like, to many of these cause and effects. Because, where's a good one? Because people devised violent oppression, God describes himself as devising disaster against the people. See how God does that? It's an appropriateness. God says, I'm just doing to you what you are doing to others, so that the consequence has a purpose. The purpose is to bring people to him. And you can see this idea working its way through. But I want to finish now with the last slide that I've got. And this is why. Why Micah? And it's a useful thing, and I've sort of deliberately left it to the end, even though you could argue perhaps it should have been at the start. But why Micah? And one of the things that I like to do when I'm doing a study like this is to write, and I won't call it a translation because it's not a translation, but try and write my own summary of whatever it is that I'm studying, and try and make it smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually I can get the book or letter or whatever it is down to one sentence. And the one sentence for Micah is this: both Israel and Judah had turned from God and would suffer consequences. But God will complete his purpose with those who listen and turn back to him. That's it. And it's simple, isn't it? And it's just as applicable to us in 2021 than it was to the times of Hezekiah 2,700 years ago. If we turn away from God, there will be consequences. It might not be Assyria coming down on us, although in the current context, the latter-day Assyrian, Russia poised there, perhaps it's not such a far-off thought as we might think. But it might not be Assyria. It might not be, the destruction of the towns that Micah was going to describe as a consequence. But there will be consequences if we turn away from God. There will be. But the beauty is that our God has a purpose, and he will complete that purpose with those who listen and turn back to him. And that's our challenge, brothers and sisters and young people, to be those who listen and turn back to God.